Hogwarts Legacy was a very visually impressive title, but also a demanding one. The game effectively channeled the source film franchise, combining excellent lighting with highly detailed assets, leading to a very high level of fidelity to the original artwork. That all came at a cost, however, with challenging CPU demands that could bring the game to low performance levels. Perhaps as a result, the promised last-gen versions were delayed by several months and have now just arrived. So how do the low-power Jaguar CPUs cope with the intense demands of Hogwarts Legacy? Is this a fundamentally compromised experience, or has it arrived in decent shape? To start off here, I thought it would be interesting to highlight the weakest console version of Hogwarts Legacy, the Xbox One release, and compare it against the weakest of the current gen versions on Series S, to get a better appreciation of the compromises that have inevitably been made to translate the game to weaker console hardware. The first and most obvious concession comes down to texture quality. At 22GB, the Xbox One version is less than half the size of the Series S download, and it shows when you examine 2D artwork up close. Most of the textures are substantially lower resolution here, with a somewhat muddy look on Microsoft's old base console. The extent of this difference varies from surface to surface, and at its worst, it's a pretty big downgrade. But it's not just the quality of textures that has taken a hit, it's also texture variety. Hogwarts Legacy's terrain was built with overlapping grime and dirt textures to better integrate rocks and stone into the environment. These elements were essentially partly occluded with high-quality textures to give them a more natural look. On Xbox One, these details are completely absent, so the stonework tends to jut out of the ground slightly awkwardly. It doesn't look bad necessarily, but the resulting treatment often looks very different from the artwork on current-gen machines. Texture loading is also heavily compromised here. Every time you move forward in the open world, the terrain takes at least a few seconds to load in the full-res foreground textures. You can actually see every little bit of texture detail pop in over time. This can take upwards of 10 seconds on the Xbox One, while the same behavior isn't really noticeable on Series S. Finally, texture filtering appears to run at a lower setting than the Series S version, which means detail at oblique angles gets badly decimated. It doesn't stand out massively, but in side-by-sides the difference is obvious. General asset work also takes a hit, though a more minor one, I would say. A lot of the more intricate meshes have been subtly stripped back. There are more obvious changes though at times, like the elaborate picture frame in this shot, or how this high poly table has been swapped for a totally different and more angular piece. And look at the wall adornments here. They're completely gone on Xbox One. If you look closely in most interior spaces, these kinds of concessions are all over the place. It's a smart move, I think, because the resulting artwork usually looks fine enough as long as you don't have a direct point of reference to the current gen versions. I suspect that most of these changes have been made to keep loading demands down, as there's a lot more duplicated assets on 1S. Lighting also gets cut back. The baked lighting has been altered as you might expect, so certain fine details are absent on the Xbox One code. This is most obvious in shadowed regions, near walls and doorways. In a few spots, certain objects also seem to just be lit incorrectly, with a much darker look than they should have had. Ambient occlusion has also been altered, producing a more crude result with less effective coverage. Shadow maps expectedly take a hit too as part of the new lighting changes. The most obvious cutback comes down to resolution, as shadow maps on the One appear much more diffuse and fail to resolve the same fine details as on current-gen consoles. They look fine most of the time, but in side-by-sides they're obviously less precise. Plus, a lot of environmental detail is no longer shadow casting. In dark interior spaces, this stands out the most, as you end up with a lot of light leaking through objects in awkward ways. Foliage density and general draw distances have also been downgraded. Grass and bushes are a bit more sparse on the last-gen console in side-by-side shots. And there's a lot of pop-in on the Xbox One, which is particularly noticeable when traversing the dense streets of Hogsmeade. On the not strictly visual front, the game suffers from extended loading times on Xbox One S as well. The short or non-existent loading animations between rooms on Series S have been lengthened considerably on the Xbox One, with the game taking quite some time to load in the new assets. Loading times for quick travel also tend to be a bit excessive, clocking in around 40 seconds or so every time you want to move from place to place. In image quality terms, the game doesn't hold up that badly against the Series S, but it definitely looks a lot less detailed. I counted a 720p resolution in every shot I tested on the Xbox One, while Series S is coming in at about 1080p here. Both consoles use FSR1 to upscale their final image output, so both machines have the sort of gently rounded, painterly look that FSR1 tends to lend to rendered imagery. The Xbox One is coming in about where I had expected here, and I don't think the image quality is all that bad, all things considered. Performance isn't especially strong, however. We're looking at a 30 FPS target here, but the game drops frames on a very frequent basis during open world traversal. A mix of 33 and 50 millisecond frames is pretty common, but larger frame time spikes also get mixed in here. Hogsmeade is probably the worst offender, though almost any area in the game can provoke dips. It's possible to hit some extended frame rate lows as well in certain areas. This foggy threshold, for instance, runs at about 20 frames per second for some reason, and this combat encounter hits the mid-20s. Flying also runs rather poorly, though this was one of the more challenging scenarios for current-gen consoles, so the disappointing performance isn't too unexpected. There's an option to unlock the frame rate as well, which produces results that are surprisingly similar to the regular performance level. In enclosed spaces we can hit the mid-40s, but elsewhere the typical run of play hovers in the low 30s. It really doesn't do much for overall fluidity and gives the game a jittery look. To be fair, the Xbox One is getting a feature-complete version of Hogwarts Legacy that looks good enough on its own terms. But a wide range of visual concessions were necessary to get the game on Xbox One hardware, and the performance level is a little bit rough. It's a workable version of the game, but current-gen hardware is delivering a fundamentally better experience. The rest of the platforms follow suit from the Xbox One version, at least for the most part. The assets, for instance, look pretty similar. The geometry is simplified in much the same ways, the same detail textures are missing, and round tables are replaced with square tables. All consoles usually show the same compromises in the exact same places, which makes sense. When it comes to lighting, however, there is something a little bit weird going on. Both Xbox One and One X are missing a lot of environmental shadows relative to the Series S, which is a difference that we've observed before. But the PS4 and PS4 Pro both showcase environmental shadows just like the Series S, producing a more realistic looking world. Perhaps this is a performance-saving optimization that just found its way onto the One X because of the shared codebase, because it otherwise doesn't make much sense. Plus, the ambient occlusion on PS4 and PS4 Pro is stronger and is a much closer match for the Series S. Again, a cutback ambient occlusion makes sense as a compromise for the weak Xbox One S hardware, but One X really shouldn't be saddled with the same settings cutbacks. Lastly, the issue I noted with texture pop-in seems to be much less of an issue on the last-gen PlayStations. Yes, this is another area where both Xbox One consoles exhibit a problem and PS4 consoles seem basically fine. You get the sense that ensuring a consistent and performant release across the Xbox One consoles wasn't a particularly high priority here, and that's unfortunate. The One X version actually seems to have more issues with loading in general, at least in my experience. Fast travel loading typically took around 75 seconds in my testing, quite a bit longer than the typical loads on other consoles. Plus, I spotted an occasional glitch where the screen would go black and texture assets would need to be loaded, which proceeded at a glacial pace. The image quality differential here is basically as expected. All consoles are again using FSR1 to upscale from their base resolutions. 720p on Xbox One, 900p on PS4, 1080p on PS4 Pro, and 1440p on the One X. There may be a little bit of variance from these figures in practice, but across my pixel counts the game seemed locked to those numbers. Hogwarts Legacy looks pretty stable on all last-gen machines, but detail and clarity improve as the base image resolution is bumped up. Performance across the last-gen machines seems to basically fall in line with the console's respective CPU power, at least when capped to 30 FPS. PS4 has some issues from time to time and performs pretty similarly to the One S version, which we looked at earlier. PS4 Pro and One X fare a good bit better, handing in a steady 30 FPS even in challenging content. The enhanced machines are perfectly capable of dropping frames, of course, and do suffer small dips occasionally, but they offer a more consistent performance level than the weaker base consoles. All consoles offer unlocked frame rate toggles as well, if you please. In the opening shot, Xbox One S and X come in at about 36 FPS, PS4 comes in at 39 FPS, and PS4 Pro comes in at 44 FPS. If we step outside, the Xboxes hit 34 FPS, PS4 hits 36 FPS, and PS4 Pro reaches 42 FPS. The consoles are likely GPU bound here, but the figures here are still sort of interesting. I wouldn't suggest using these options on any of the console platforms though, as all offer a very inconsistent game experience. I also took a quick peek at the current gen versions to see if the performance woes, specifically the frame rate issues that afflicted the Xbox Series versions of the game, had been resolved. Unfortunately, I didn't see any major improvements on this front, at least when walking through Hogsmeade, which is the game's signature performance trouble spot. It's unfortunate that these problems haven't been resolved, but the PS5 version of the game does remain a smooth experience, relatively speaking, and the series releases fare well enough in most areas. Ultimately, how you evaluate the last generation versions of Hogwarts Legacy really depends on your point of reference. Relative to the existing current gen releases, the downgrades are very significant and extend further than we typically see in cross-gen titles. Environmental assets, lighting, and performance have all taken big hits here, but judged on its own terms, it's still a reasonable enough effort, and it still effectively translates the look of the popular movie franchise to a video game. The Xbox One versions have a handful of extra concessions, however, that makes them a bit tougher to recommend. The texture streaming issues in particular seem odd, and the lighting cutbacks also annoy. Hopefully these problems can be addressed in future updates. Hogwarts Legacy remains an impressive achievement, and offers a compelling experience for fans of the Source franchise. Just be aware that the last-gen versions take a substantial hit, especially on Xbox. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and press the bell for YouTube notifications. Check out the Patreon at digitalfinder.net for exclusive and early access content. And to get in touch, just use Twitter. Thanks for watching.